Yep. Okay. So we should put this map up on the
We all
screen.
have pens.
Yep, I got pens distributed. All right, we're on the map, so we'll just talk about the map here. All right, so the Sinai Peninsula, there is between the two northern arms of the Red Sea. I have seen 6 or 7 different locations for the crossing of the Red Sea. None of them are on the wide part of the Red Sea further to the south. That has never been suggested or proposed. Many of them are on the Gulf of Suez on the left.
Is that where the Suez Canal is?
The Suez Canal connects from the Gulf of Suez up to the Mediterranean Sea,
I heard
the
one
blue line to
theory
the north.
that it was when they first crossed that little river where the Suez Canal is.
Yep.
Near Goshen.
Yep, I've heard lots of different theories. So, one theory is that they crossed low on the Gulf of Suez. Another one is that they crossed very high at the very tip there, right where the Suez Canal connects to the Gulf of Suez, and they just went across a little hop, skip, and a jump. Another one is that it wasn't the Red Sea at all, but it was actually that lake in between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. That one has less support, but that's one that people think is more believable, so that's why they proposed that one.
What was the water level like at this time? Or sea level?
Presumably close to where it's at now. Another one actually has this up in the Mediterranean Sea. If you notice that city called Pelusium, there's that sandbar that goes up north of there. There's a few gaps in the sandbar, and some people have proposed that it was up there. I think that this map has one of the more likely locations for the crossing of the Red Sea for several different reasons. Number one is that the Egyptians at this time frame seem to control the Sinai Peninsula, and so if they were crossing the Gulf of Suez from Egypt proper just onto the Sinai Peninsula, that would be ridiculously weird because they'd still be in Egyptian territory. So that doesn't work as smoothly. Most of the other ones just strip away the miraculous. One professor I had even had the land of Goshen on the west side of the Nile River, and that crossing the Red Sea was actually just crossing the Nile River Delta. That was the most cockamamie idea I've ever heard, that no one else has ever said. I've never heard anybody propose the land of Goshen being west of the Nile. I've only ever heard that on the east side of the Nile, where it's located on this map. Now the other part of the equation is, where is the Mount of Sinai? There is a New Testament reference that Paul makes talking about Sinai being in Arabia, not down on the Sinai Peninsula. That's the only biblical reference that would connect it anywhere. Interestingly enough, that's 1,500 years later in the New Testament, and not even in the Old Testament.
Because didn't Paul go to Arabia?
Paul went to Arabia, yep, so he was familiar with that neighborhood.
So do we know when it was forgotten where Mount Sinai is?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure when that shifted. Somebody in the 4th century AD, I think, identified Mount Sinai as being in the peninsula of the Sinai there, and they founded a monastery in that neighborhood, or a convent or something of the sort. And so sometime after the New Testament, but yeah, so nailing down which mountain is a little bit more challenging.
Didn't Elijah also travel to Mount Sinai?
Yep, Elijah also went to Mount Sinai.
So you'd have to be within 40 days travel.
Yeah, but you can get a really long ways in 40 days from the land of Israel. All this qualifies. So, one of the other things that's just a logistical challenge is that you've got the people of Israel that need to camp at the foot of the mountain, and you need a lot of space to be able to camp 2 million, 3 million people. And the Sinai Peninsula actually does not have many options for that kind of space. As you can see on this map, it actually shows the ruggedness of the terrain quite well. Only on the left side of the peninsula, the west side, along this Gulf of Suez, is there any relatively level desert where you could actually conceive of a few million people setting up tents and camping. In that stretch, it would be possible.
Maybe the continuation of the Gulf of Arabia too. You can kind of see what Gulf of Arabia used to be with a lot of
Are you talking about the Gulf of Aqaba?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I can-
So what about the Gulf of Aqaba?
Well, just coming off of it, going north from there, there's a valley that they could conceivably get to.
Yeah, but that's a known valley with a specific name that is not confused with it all. That's near Zered and a few other things. Yeah.
Sure.
So, anyhow, this particular location is now currently, or the mountain is known as Jabal al-Laz. The difficulty with this mountain is it's in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia doesn't take tourists and they don't take archaeologists from the West. And so you can't really poke around there. I have heard rumors that there is a lot of Ugaritic script inscribed onto the rocks in that neighborhood. Ugaritic was the writing in the language that preceded Hebrew that we have in the Hebrew Bible today, which didn't really come around until about the time of the captivity in Babylon, because languages shift and morph and such. And so the alphabet's the same, it's just the more ancient, archaic form of Hebrew writing. And some of the rocks inscribed apparently had some graffiti, and people were putting their opinions about Moses down in writing and such. So in theory you can find that there, but the Muslim government of Saudi Arabia is not letting that be really open for Westerners to go exploring. So it ends up being kind of quite shrouded in mystery. But by that mountain to the southwest, you'll notice there's a very large open flat pizza desert, and you can look at all this in Google Earth and see, and even more so, that shows that that would work really well for an encampment for a great number of people. And then there's a very narrow path that leads up to the mountain itself. The other thing that points in favor of the crossing of the Red Sea in that neighborhood is that there is actually a place right along the Red Sea where there is space for an encampment of the Israelites to be right up next to the Red Sea. And then the description says they're blocked by the mountains to the north and to the south, and they were blocked by the Egyptians on one side and the sea on the other side. And if you look at that on Google Earth, you can see the geography and be like, yep, that totally fits the description of Exodus and the Red Sea crossing.
And then you can go down on Street View and be like, this really does fit it.
Yep, Street View really fits it. And then the other thing that really is the nail in the coffin for me is that if you look at the contours of the Gulf there is a gentle slope going down into the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba and a gentle slope rising back up. There's actually an undersea ridge right at that point where it is substantially shallower. Not like 10 feet shallow, but like 200 feet shallow, as opposed to like 1,000 or 1,500 feet shallow. Because if you've got to get 600,000 people across the Red Sea, having them scramble down cliff sides that have recently dried is not a speedy way of doing it, nor do chariots drive into it. But at that particular location, underwater, you could see this could work. Chariots could try to do that, people could walk that, old people, young people, camels, donkeys, and everything else.
I think there's...
So there's a good shot that that's it. But you have to take everything with this, like this, with a caveat. And that is probably in the right neighborhood, good chance of it, but there's always a chance that it's somewhere else, and somebody might come up with a good reason for that somewhere else later.
Is that going to be fun chariots?
One person has claimed that they did, and that unfortunately is a relatively unscrupulous archaeologist who is not known for having particularly good
Credibility?
credibility is one thing, but he doesn't actually document things well. And so no one can go and find the same thing again. So he takes pictures of things, but you don't have a frame of reference of where this is. No one else can go find it. You can't go look at it. Nobody else can see it and substantiate what he's evaluating. Really poor documentation. So, but yes, in theory, you'd be able to find an Egyptian army under the sea there. And I would love to do some maritime archaeology to go hunting for that, because could be there, that would be findable.
And if it is,
Well, then we could verify it. So, yep. I don't suggest you go walking around the Sinai Peninsula though, because it is littered with landmines from the 6 Days War and the Yom Kippur War. And so that's the other detail in that neighborhood, is not conducive to archaeology when you might lose a leg.
I forgot about that detail. Gosh
Yep. All right. So that was our map digression just to start this off with. We'll go backwards and do this proper now. All right, so we are in the Exodus era fully. We are one lesson behind the original plan. I will come out with a new version in just a few weeks, but if you look at your fall calendar, you can just push everything back 1 week and that will be accurate. So it ends up looking like this. We are covering the Exodus tonight. We don't have class next week. In 2 weeks, we'll come back and we'll look at the law and the tabernacle. And before Thanksgiving on the 24th, we will cover the feasts and the calendar. And then we'll have Thanksgiving break, so we'll have another week off there, which is why the reading plan does not have a memory verse or meditation that day. And then we will be coming back into the conquest.
So appropriate discussing the feast just before Thanksgiving.
The feast. I know, that is appropriate. That was really well timed. Not even intentional. All right. Where are we here? We covered Job last week. So the Exodus. There we go. The Exodus era, as opposed to the beginnings and the patriarch era, stretches out over more than one book. So we have it in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it is actually a fairly lengthy period of time, but almost all of it elapses in Exodus chapter 1, where they have their 215 years in Egypt, and it is just about gone. So the early life of Moses is covered in Exodus chapter 2, and by the time we get to Exodus chapter 3, he's like 80 years old. And that 80 years of age is included in that 215 years in Egypt. Now this is known as a short sojourn in Egypt. There are other people that have the long sojourn theory where you have 430 years in Egypt. So the short version is what James Ussher goes with, and it works genealogically much better. There's a genealogy of Moses. Moses was one of the Levites, and the genealogy of Moses goes from Levi to Kohath, his son, to Amram, his son, to Moses. And there's only 2 generations between Levi and Moses. And stretching or getting 430 years into that 2 generations is extremely challenging because we know how long they each lived. I think Levi lived to 137, and Kohath lived to 133, and Amram also lived to about 133. And if each of them had their son at the last year of their life, it could theoretically work. But that's really challenging to do. 215 years in Egypt is much easier because Levi and Moses almost overlap then. And it's much more believable because we have the genealogy of Moses. But it's also supported in Galatians chapter 3. So, and there's actually another 400-year period. I forgot to bring this out in the patriarchs, but remember Abraham has his son Isaac, and God tells him, your descendants will be persecuted in a land not their own for 400 years, and then I will save them. That's why most people think that the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. But that persecution actually began with Isaac, who was persecuted in a land not his own, because they didn't own the land of Canaan yet, on his 5th birthday when he was weaned, and Ishmael was mocking him, which is what caused the original kerfuffle between them. Anyhow, so
When does that 400
that 400 years starts when Isaac is 5 years old, and it lines up perfectly for the Exodus to be the end of it. It's an independent confirmation of that time frame. So it's 430 years from Abraham landing in the land of Canaan at the age of 75. Abraham is 105 when Isaac gets mocked, and so then you have 100 years left to the end of when the Exodus takes place. So that is why I believe in a shorter sojourn period. 215 years in Egypt, 215 years while they were in Canaan before that time frame. All right. One of the fascinating things about the Exodus itself is that it's a 40-year period, but we only get to read about 3 of them. So the first year of the Exodus is covered in Exodus chapters 13 through 39. The second year begins in Exodus 40 and goes through Numbers 19. And then we find ourselves in the 40th year of the Exodus, and the 37 years in between are just not recorded. Nothing is written down about them other than in one place where they talk about how they moved from here to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, to there. And that is it. And the 40th year is then the majority of the book of Deuteronomy and the entirety of the rest of the book of Numbers. We'll revisit that here as we get to that event. So the 215 years in Egypt last from 1706 to 1491, according to James Ussher's chronology. And I suspect that it was the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom that were ruling when Joseph was there and Jacob arrived at that time. So the Old Kingdom is the pharaohs and the dynasties that were building the pyramids. It was a relatively peaceful and prosperous time in Egypt. And then they descended into a period of chaos for an unknown period of time. And then they had a middle kingdom where the kingdom restored order again. The middle kingdom lasts for a short period of time, and then they descend into anarchy again until they have the new kingdom. So the new kingdom is where Ramses, the famous pharaoh, is from, and Seti, one of the other famous pharaohs, is also from them. And one of the challenges with Egyptian chronology is that Manetho, the Egyptian historian who was trying to record Egyptian history, was trying to make his civilization sound like the oldest one on the earth, because that would give them some sort of primacy. This was a competition going on amongst all of the historians of that day. And so he lined up all of the dynasties of Egypt and essentially slinkied out the whole timeline of Egyptian history, adding probably about 800 years to it. And it's become quite apparent to a lot of historians that there's a lot of time in that chronology that just isn't existing. There's a few ways that you can deslinky it and compress it back down. One way is that Manetho has several different dynasties ruling from different cities consecutively, and if they were all ruling and competing at the same time, then you'd lose a lot of years. And then there's another dynasty that the archaeologists haven't found a single inscription in reference to. They haven't found a single tomb. They think that one is a completely fictional dynasty that just didn't even exist. And so that is also another possibility. So the Egyptian chronology is kind of challenging to sort out, because you'll usually read about how the pyramids were built in 2700 BC, but that's 450 years before the flood, and that doesn't work because the pyramids were built out of limestone that was formed at the end of the flood. Pyramids are definitely built post-flood. Flood definitely happened in 2348. So, got to squish Egyptian history down a fair amount. At the end of the Old Kingdom, though, the Egyptians seem to go through some sort of famine. One thing I read about our archaeologists, they discovered that all of the people in Egypt depopulated the countryside and gathered around the cities. And it sounds a lot like the 7 years of famine that Joseph lived through and orchestrated, because they were not going to sow and they were not going to reap for 7 years. And if you're a farmer, why hang out on the farm if there's no food there, but you have to get all your food in the city? And that's where all the entertainment is, and that's where all the people are too. And they actually see this in the archaeology, where all of the small little settlements and farming communities just completely get depopulated and everybody is living in the store cities. And that happened right at the end of the Old Kingdom, just before a period of chaos comes in. So Joseph doesn't die until 1635. His brother Levi dies in 1619. And at some point in time in there, a new pharaoh who knew not Joseph, which would be a new dynasty coming to power, possibly even a foreign power, the Hyksos, not the Middle Kingdom. Yeah, there was a foreign invasion by a people called the Hyksos. And it could be that the pharaoh who knew not Joseph was a Hyksos pharaoh.
That would make sense.
It would make sense. It's not guaranteed, hard to pin down. In the year 1572 or 73, that Pharaoh commands that all the Israelite boys get thrown into the Nile River. That's the year that, or the time frame of which Moses was born. We know it was after Aaron was born because Aaron wasn't thrown into the Nile River, nor did he have that threat, and he was 3 years older.
How many Israelites were there at this point?
I don't know. 80 years later, there were 600,000 men.
That's crazy.
Yes.
Like, wow, 215 years ago from
Hmm.
12 to...
So Moses gets born in 1571. His father is Amram, who is the grandson of Levi. And you can see there, with Levi dying at 1619 and Moses getting born at 1571, the generations are very believable that Kohath and Amram could be in between there. His mother's name is Jochebed. The wording is challenging because sometimes it looks like she is a direct daughter of Levi. It's also possible that she was just a descended granddaughter of Levi. It could be translated both ways. So it's possible that Amram married his aunt, Jochebed, and they had Moses, or it's also possible that Jochebed was just a cousin, once or twice removed. Moses gets raised by Pharaoh's daughter, though. For 40 years, he's in Pharaoh's household until 1531 when he flees Egypt after he killed an Egyptian and was persona non grata. So he heads into the wilderness, and he's living with the Midianites, and this is probably in the neighborhood of Sinai, actually. And he may have been all the way on the far side of the wilderness where Job was residing, or at least traveled back and forth there while shepherding sheep in the Arabian Peninsula. But after 40 years, he's 80 years old. God calls to him from the burning bush, commands him to lead Israel out of Egypt, and gives him Aaron as his speaker. And Moses meets Aaron on his way back to Egypt. And this is where the Exodus account gets really dramatic and exciting, because the plagues start coming. And one of the things I want to illustrate is how God was actually demonstrating his power over the Egyptian pantheon through each of these plagues. There was a lot more than just death and destruction and woe. The plague of blood strikes the Nile River, and the Egyptians worship the Nile River. I've heard of several names for that god, but Hapi is the one I found in this version. Hapi, the god of the Nile, was shown to be powerless when the entire Nile River, which is supposed to be the giver of life in Egypt, all of a sudden was blood and brought death, and nobody could drink it, and it killed all the fish, and it was just miserable and awful. And the second plague, the plague of frogs, they worshipped a frog god named Heket, a god of fertility. Apparently in Egypt, people didn't reproduce like rabbits, they reproduced like frogs. Probably didn't have a lot of rabbits in Egypt, now that I think about it. Native rabbit species of Egypt. There's the Google search for the night. So the frogs came out of the Nile River, and the frog god was demonstrated to be completely inept. And then there's the plague of gnats, which came out of the dust of the earth, if I remember this right. And that was Geb, the god of the earth that they worshipped. Followed by the plague of flies. That would have been miserable. If you ever go up to the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota, there is a certain week, roughly in July, that you don't want to be there because the flies are out and they are utterly miserable and they are not afraid of DEET. So you can't repel them with anything known to mankind. And it is just utter misery for an entire week until they are all gone. And when they're all gone, then the North Boundary Waters are pleasant again. The plague of livestock, that one was was against the god Hathor, which was a calf god that the Egyptians worshipped. Probably the inspiration for the calf god that they make later during the Exodus. But Hathor was one of the important gods in the shape of a calf. All the livestock die. Clearly, the calf god does not have any power. Yep. So it continues. There's the plague of boils, which demonstrates the powerlessness of Isis, a goddess of medicine.
I remember.
Yep. ISIS is, yeah, a terrorist organization and an Egyptian goddess. Kind of funny how that works. And then the thing that was always amusing is the Obama administration was always trying to refer to it as ISIL, not ISIS. And so the press would always call it ISIS, and then every presidential speech about it would refer to ISIL.
Why?
Islamic State in the Levant was ISIL. Islamic State in... No, I can't remember what the IS stood for, the second IS in ISIS, but stood for. In Syria. Yeah, that's what, he wasn't using Syria. We would always call it the Levant, which is a obscure geographic term for that portion of the Middle East. Yep, it's not, anyhow. Moving on though, we have the plague of hail, which comes out of the sky, demonstrating the powerlessness of the goddess of the sky, Nut or Newt, I'm not sure which one that would be pronounced. Yeah, the plague of locusts, the likes of which the world has never seen since. Seth, the god of disorder. I'm not sure if that was a locust god or what, but
Seth, is that worshiping forefather?
no. No, just Egyptian pronunciation of a god's name.
I see.
The plague of darkness, what hits really home. This one demonstrates the powerlessness of the sun god. And what's also fascinating is the land of Goshen had daylight. They were not, the sun was not blocked from the land of Goshen. If you look at your map, Goshen is just a little bit to the east of the whole Nile River. And so this one is one that has intrigued me, and I want to do some archaeological research and do some digging because I have a theory. This is a David George original. You won't find this anywhere else in other literature. But they talk about how the plague of darkness was a darkness so thick you could feel it. And I have read that description about volcanic eruptions and ash falls, is that the darkness from it is so thick you can feel it. Because it actually is falling around you and you can actually hold it in your hand.
You feel it.
But it is darkness completely midnight at midday because it blocks out the sun so badly. But this one, if it was a volcano that was to the north, while the prevailing wind was blowing to the south, which is the prevailing wind direction in Egypt, which allowed them to navigate their boats up the river by sail, that would park the Nile River in darkness and the land of Goshen would be in daylight. If this happened, there should be an ashfall layer that is discernible in the archaeological record, and we could date the Exodus very specifically across the entire land of Egypt.
That would be crazy.
And there's no shortage of volcanoes to the north in Turkey that could have generated such an eruption, so this is not like inconceivable.
And then
There was a very famous volcanic eruption called Santorini that was a couple hundred years before this, but that's the one that destroyed the Minoan civilization with a 150-foot tsunami. It was a big civilization on Crete, and the whole thing was wiped out in one day by a giant wave from a volcano that erupted across the Aegean Sea from them.
you know what we could also be able to figure out though?
What?
There should be a large discernible area without ash. That would then be the land of Goshen.
Mhm.
And we could then determine what the land of Goshen was.
That's not nearly as in much in dispute. I just had one crazy professor who thought it was on the other side of the Nile River, but
Right.
So we can
You're right.
disprove the crazies.
yep, it would demonstrate that the land of Goshen was where it is, because you wouldn't find any ash there.
I like that theory, but I always thought, because I've got spelunking before,
Yeah,
and if you turn off your flashlight when you're spelunking, it's so dark you feel creepy, it feels creepy, it feels like your
Yeah.
skin crawling. So when I ever read that,
mhm,
I've always, that's how I always
mhm.
associated it.
Then it felt like it should be light, so it just felt.
Well, when you spelunk in a cave, there's zero light
Oh,
source.
yeah.
So, I mean, but if you turn off your flashlight, it's an eerie, it's really eerie.
Anyway, like I said, that's a David George original theory. You're not going to find anybody talking about that on the internet because it's not there yet. Maybe I'll put it out there and then people will talk about it. But
Maybe somebody else is independent.
yep, somebody else may have independently come up with it. If so, anyhow, one of the reasons why I think that's a possibility, though, is that God oftentimes uses natural phenomena to execute his miracles and such. And so, for instance, the plague of locusts was brought in by a wind. And so they were moved into place. And then the same thing with the parting of the Red Sea. God used a wind to separate the waters. It's still crazy miraculous because the timing of it is insane. And then also, if it was that part of the Red Sea and it was parted 200 feet deep, like, that doesn't happen. So it's very, very supernatural. But God still used a wind, and we understand what wind is. So
In the case of a volcano, wouldn't Moses say what was going to happen?
yeah, that was the other thing, is Moses always told Pharaoh what was going to take place, and then it would take place. And so it wasn't like he was just saying, oh, this is the plague my God sent on you. He would tell him what was going to happen, and then it would happen. So there's no shortage of supernatural going on, and I'm not trying to diminish from that in any way, shape, or form. Just a theoretical possible explanation for that. All right, so we already looked at this map. This shows one possible route for the Exodus travels, and it's a challenging thing because one of the few locations that we can identify very concretely that they did pass through on 2 occasions in the Exodus is the city of Kadesh Barnea, which is way up on the southern part of Judah. So that location we know they passed through twice. We know that they came into the land of Israel 40 years later from the east, and so they passed along through Moab, or next to Edom and next to Moab, and then they started into Heshbon there. Everything in the middle there in between is a little bit fuzzier, because we don't know precisely where the waters of Mara were, where the 70 palm trees of Elam were, and Mount Sinai is obviously speculative, as any location will be. So you can take this map with a grain of salt, but it gives the general gist of where they were headed and how they were moving. So the timing for this Exodus, they leave in the spring of 1491. They cross the Red Sea. The Egyptian army gets destroyed. That's one of the biggest reasons why we know Ramses II, the famous pharaoh, who's always the pharaoh in the Exodus movies, is not the actual pharaoh, because Ramses II does not die in the Red Sea by drowning. He dies of old age much later in life, and this pharaoh died in the Red Sea. So they love making the theatrical versions, have Ramses II be the pharaoh that Moses was talking with, but it is not possible at all. Historically inaccurate. Shortly after they cross the Red Sea, though, the manna begins to fall from heaven, and that persists for 40 years. They get attacked by the Amalekites. Joshua leads the army out. They defeat the Amalekites, then drive them off, and God swears an oath that he will destroy the Amalekites from the face of the earth, and that is fulfilled several hundred years later, we'll find in January.
Holds up his arms.
Yes, that is when Moses is holding up his arms and the army can prevail.
And then he has Aaron and
Her helping hold up his arms. Yep. They get to Mount Sinai in fulfillment of the sign that God gave Moses. I'm speaking to you, and this will be your sign. You'll lead the Israelites out of Egypt and worship me on this mountain. And that's where he receives the 10 Commandments. While he's getting the 10 Commandments, Aaron is making a golden calf. And so then Moses goes down the mountain, deals with that, breaks the original stones, has to go back up on the mountain for another 40 days. It looks like Moses went 80 days without food or water, which would be another supernatural event, because people don't do that. Gandhi came close. I think he made it to 73 or 78 days. Mahatma Gandhi,
Food or water?
without food, he drank water. Yeah.
Okay.
Gandhi, the statesman from India, was protesting something in the British colonial rule, and he went on a hunger strike, and it lasted 70 some days before he ate, and he was up to really close to dying, but he didn't die. He survived it.
That's crazy.
Yep.
What's so important about like 40? It's like he's 40 years in like Pharaoh's house and 40 years in the desert, and then they wandered for 40 years,
Hmm.
God
and he
knows.
went up the mountain for 40 days.
There are a lot of 40s, aren't there?
God knows 40.
Yes. I believe it is the number of testing or something of the sorts. 40-day periods come regularly. There's a few 40-year periods actually too.
And that's why King's reigns last for 40 years.
Yep, king's reigns last for 40 years. Pieces last for 40 years in the judges period. And all kinds of things hit 40s. 40 days and 40 nights of rain, 40 days for Elijah's journey to Mount Sinai, many generations later.
Do you think it's possible there's also just like a rounding number? Like we round to 50s and 100s, they rounded to 40?
Theoretically possible, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I haven't heard that ever proposed. It's a Micaiah original.
Nice.
All right, so other events of the first year, they get the instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the furnishings, and the priestly garments, and they proceed to go ahead and build them. And the reading plan for this last week did not include that, but I think there's a week that will cover some of that coming up here. So then we get to the end of the book of Exodus, and we shift into the second year. And this is when they get the tabernacle actually set up, and they do the first census of the people of Israel, and they find that they have 603,550 men of fighting age, which is 20 years and older.
How did they get to that big of a population so fast?
They were fruitful and they multiplied. Yeah. 215 years, they went from 70 to 603,550.
Oh, there were 70 men that went down? Or I thought that was.
Yep, there were 70 men that went down with Jacob when he went to Egypt. 70 male descendants. It was Jacob and his sons and their sons. 3 generations were representative there. And those 3 generations and 70 men turned into 603,000 in 215 years. It is prolific reproductive rate. But they were in Egypt, which is the land of plenty, and it is very easy to supply people with food in Egypt, and always has been. So it is not far-fetched. They should have had a really high survival rate. So another thing that happens in the second year of the Exodus, the oldest 2 sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, die. They get burned by fire because they offered an unauthorized fire sacrifice. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, visits him and gives him some administrative ideas for how to govern over the people of Israel while they're in the wilderness. And then they're sent quail for a month, and then that is followed by a plague that wipes out a number of them. Halfway through the second year, they spy out the land. And this is when the 12 spies go forth. 10 bring back the bad report, 2 had a good report. The 2 that had the good report were Joshua and Caleb. They say that the land flows with milk and honey, but there's giants there known as the Nephilim. Those are the ancestors of Goliath. And they fled the land later during the conquest of Joshua and went and lived with the Philistines. That's why we have Goliath showing up in Gath a few generations later. So the people of Israel rebel. They don't want to go into the land, and they had tried to elect somebody else to lead them back to Egypt, and God wants to destroy them. Moses intervenes, and God declares that they will wander for 40 years. Now that 40 years is inclusive of the year and a half that they had already been out in the wilderness. So they should have only been in the wilderness for 18 months, but they got an extra 38 and a half years because of their rebellion.
Because they can wait.
When they realize they're going to get 40 years in the wilderness, then they try to take Canaan by themselves. Moses and the ark don't go up with them, and it doesn't go well with them. after all that, amazingly enough, some people still don't believe that Moses should be leading them, and so there's another rebellion by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And this one is an exciting story because Moses says if something new happens that kills these men, something that no one has ever seen before, like the ground opens up its mouth and swallows them alive, and then that is precisely what happened. 250 men get consumed by fire because they were offering incense offering and censers that they were not authorized to offer, and the rest of them are swallowed up by the ground. And then to confirm Moses and Aaron's leadership, God has them all bring a staff forward, and the next day Moses' staff, with his name on it, produced,
But that's Aaron's.
it was Aaron's staff, yep. Aaron's staff produces buds, leaves, and almonds. So, that was an impressive stick. That's the one that turned into a snake, that's the one that turned the Red Sea into blood, that's the one that parted the Nile River turned into blood, that's the one that was used to part the Red Sea, and now that same staff produces almonds after it's been a dead stick for who knows how long.
That's crazy.
Do we know it was the same staff?
It's the staff. Yep. You can do a case study of that staff and follow it through the Exodus. It was supposed to stay in the Ark of the Covenant after it budded and produced almonds. Later in the days of Samuel, the Ark did not have the staff of Aaron in it any longer. After that final rebellion and almonds getting produced, there's 37 years of silent wandering in the wilderness that are not recorded, and nothing of consequence happens except that 603,548 men become carcasses in the wilderness. And suddenly, we find ourselves in the 40th year. Miriam, the older sister of Moses, dies at the ripe old age of 120 something or other, at least 126 or 7, I would imagine. Her age is not given, though. This is when Moses strikes the rock when he was supposed to speak to the rock. It's kind of interesting because if you read the New Testament, it sounds like this rock was following them around in the wilderness and producing water for them when necessary. And at least this, they camped out next to this rock regularly. But yeah, the interesting thing with this rock, this produced water for them. Manna from heaven, water from the rock, and they were supplied. It doesn't take God much. He's got the creativity to take care of our needs, it seems like. But anyway, since Moses disobeyed, he is forbidden to enter the land of Canaan at the age of 120. His brother Aaron dies at the age of 123, which means his son Eleazar becomes the high priest. War starts here, and the conquest is actually beginning in this 40th year of the Exodus. So this is a little bit fuzzy and there's a little bit of overlap. They first fight against the Canaanite king of Arad down in the Negev, south of the Dead Sea on your map. And they defeat him. Shortly after that you have the plague of snakes, and then they erect the bronze serpent, and anyone who looks on the bronze serpent is saved, which is another type of Christ. And that's also where we get our medical symbol in the United States today. The snake intertwined on a staff is,
Didn't the Greeks do that too?
I'm not sure.
Maybe.
Okay, maybe there's another origin.
I really did.
Alright. Maybe I've got a mistaken source.
Yeah.
Alright. We'll dig into that later.
Never seen it.
So the Israelites want to go through the land of Edom, and the Edomites deny them passage. Edom is their cousins. These are the descendants of Esau. And so they are not supposed to go to war with the Edomites. They are not supposed to take their land because that is the inheritance that Esau and his descendants inherited from Isaac, the southern portion there, the land of Canaan. Jacob's supposed to go elsewhere. So they go around the land of Edom, and they end up passing beside Moab and next to Ammon, and then war breaks out on the east side of the Jordan River in this 40th year here. And Joshua leads the army. They defeat Sihon, the king of Heshbon. He was an Amorite king. And you can see Heshbon on your map there. It should be in that neighborhood. And then further to the north is Bashan. Og was the king up there. He was another giant. And Sihon was also one of the giants. They're known as Rephites. Rephaites.
Was Og the one with the like 12-foot bed?
Yep, Og had an iron bed. I believe its dimensions were 6 feet by 10 feet, which gives the connotation that this guy was big, because who needs a bed that's 10 feet long? So his actual dimensions are not actually written down, but
6 feet by 10 feet.
yeah. The Israelites start defeating the Amorite kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan River. At this time, the king of Moab gets freaked out. Now you remember the Moabites and the Ammonites are descended from Lot's daughters and Lot himself. And so they are distanter cousins of the Israelites. Another Hebrew kingdom, because they are descended from Eber, but they are very concerned, so Balak sends for Balaam, and Balaam is a really strange character because he's a prophet of God Most High from the other side of the Euphrates River who comes to cast curses on the Israelites, even though he realizes he can't.
The Euphrates River, that's like a long ways away.
Crazy long ways away, yeah. He's called from by the Euphrates River, ridiculously long ways away.
He was-
Probably in the neighborhood of the Arameans where Laban was living. That's a long ways
quite
off.
the reputation.
Yes, quite a reputation to be drawn from that distance away.
It's also quite the time, because he sends them
Mhm.
there, and then they go back, and then
Yep.
go again.
Yep, so Balak really wanted him to curse the Israelites. He only blesses them though. But Balaam comes up with an alternative idea, and so he teaches Balak how he can get the Moabite and Midianite women to seduce the Israelite men into sexual immorality, and that's how they can make them stumble. And so plague breaks out in the camp because the judgment of God falls on them. And this is the one where Phinehas takes a spear and runs 2 people through, and that's when the plague stops and God, what's the word I'm looking for? Encourages Phinehas in his zeal.
Yeah, that's quite the zeal.
Yep. After that, they take a second census, 601,730 people, and not one of those had been alive in the previous census except for Joshua and Caleb.
So, not been alive, that's.
Well, they would not have been over the age of 20.
Right.
Yes.
So,
Half of them could have been alive, but they would have been 19 or younger. So then, as you can see on the map, they're coming up on the east side of the land of Canaan there, and then they get to the Jordan. And one of the interesting things is after they take over the kingdom of Bashan and Heshbon, some of the tribes realize this is really good land and this would be great for grazing, and so we would like to settle here since we just depopulated this territory. And so this is Gad, Reuben, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, and they make arrangements to inherit that piece of land over there. And then at this point in time, Moses assembles the entirety of Israel and preaches a long sermon at them, which is now known as the Book of Deuteronomy. The end of the Book of Deuteronomy must have been written by Joshua because Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. So I suspect that Joshua wrote the final chapter. Joshua gets appointed by God as Moses' successor, and then Moses dies on Mount Nebo. Thus ends the Exodus. So we just blitzed through 4 chapters, or 4 books of the entire Old Testament, although we will come back here the next couple weeks in November and go through some of the Moses, or the Law of Moses. Does anybody have any questions over the events of the Exodus, though? All right. So 40 years go by in the Exodus, and they left Egypt in 1491. When did they land in Canaan?
1451.
Yep, very good, 1451. Now that's about 200 years earlier than most historians place the Israelites entering Canaan. It's kind of funny because they figure that Israelites entered Canaan in the 1200s because that's when Ramses was pharaoh. So if they left Ramses and then went to Canaan, it would be around 1200. And that's the most ridiculous line of logic I've ever heard in my life. But Ramses comes much later, and he's not in the scriptures to my knowledge at all. All right. So we have 2 weeks, and we'll be back, and we'll look at some of the law of Moses, make a little bit of sense of all of it, look at the feasts in the calendar, and then in December we'll be jumping into the conquest. Have a good night and a good week.